In the last week of June 1941, a Soviet crew climbed out of a running tank near the town of Brody and walked away from it. The tank was clean. Its plates showed not a scratch. The engine still turned over under their hands. But the fuel gauge sat on empty, and no truck was coming. There was no radio to ask anyone what to do. So they left the best tank in the world sitting in a wheat field and went east on foot. That tank was a KV-1. Nothing the German army had that morning could punch through its front plate, yet it never fired a shot. This is the Battle of Brody. 6 days in a triangle of Ukrainian farmland between Dubno, Lutsk and Brody. The largest tank battle in history up to that point. Bigger than anything at Kursk 2 years later. 6 Soviet mechanized corps, near 3,500 tanks, drove into the flank of one German panzer group with roughly 750. The Soviets had the numbers and the armour. They had the 2 finest tanks anyone on Earth could field that summer, the KV-1 and the T-34. In 6 days, they lost more than 2,600 of them. Most were thrown away, not beaten by any German gun. The whole tragedy started with the machine itself. The KV-1 weighed about 45 tons and carried armour 3 inches thick at the front. The T-34 was faster and just as hard to kill. Germany's standard anti-tank gun that summer, the 37mm, could do nothing against the front of a KV-1. The Germans wrote down what it felt like. One battle report describes a lone T-34 rolling straight into a line of dug-in anti-tank guns. Half a dozen anti-tank guns fire shells at him, which sound like a drum roll, it reads. But he drives staunchly through our line like an impregnable prehistoric monster. The same report says Lieutenant Stopp landed 5 hits on a T-34, 1 from 20 yards and 4 from 50. It records the result in 3 words, without any noticeable effect. German soldiers had a bitter nickname for the 37mm gun by August. The Panzerangklopfgerät. The tank door knocker. Because that is all it did. It knocked, and the door never opened. To stop the Soviet armour at all, the Germans had to haul up the 88mm anti-aircraft gun and fire it flat across the ground or scream for the dive bombers. Listen to who said the last word on it. Ewald von Kleist commanded the German tanks in this very battle. After the war, he called the T-34 the finest tank in the world. That is the enemy general, talking about the machine that beat every gun he owned. Berlin had no weapon that could reliably kill the Soviet heavy tank. Moscow found a way to lose more than 2,600 of them in under a week anyway. The armour was there in staggering quantity. Kirponos, the general holding the southwestern front, had 5,465 tanks when the Germans crossed the border. The catch is inside that number. Only 774 of them were the modern types. The rest were old, light, worn thin from years of training, a single hard march from breaking. And the 3 best equipped corps held 717 of the good ones between them. Nearly half of every heavy and medium tank the Soviet Union had yet built, all sitting in one corner of Ukraine. This was the sharpest armoured fist in the world. What broke it over the next 6 days was not the German army. The men inside those tanks had barely been allowed to learn them. Many KV and T-34 crews had reached their units only weeks before. Some had a few hours at the controls. A few had trained on older machines and were meeting the new ones for the first time. Worse, the tanks were starving for the right ammunition. The heavy guns wanted armour-piercing shells that had never arrived in the numbers needed. So the best protected tanks on Earth rolled forward with green crews and the wrong rounds in the racks. The machine was ready. Nothing around it was. It began, as these things do, with an order nobody on the ground believed in. On the second day of the invasion, with the front already cracking, Moscow's Directive No. 3 demanded an immediate counterattack. The order forbade any thought of digging in or falling back to ground the tanks could hold. It wanted a full armoured counterstroke at once, straight into the teeth of the German advance. Georgy Zhukov himself came down to see it done. Kirponos argued back. He wanted to pull his corps together, dig the anti-tank guns in and hit the Germans on ground he had chosen. He was overruled. The attack would go in now, with whatever showed up, in whatever order it arrived. That one decision doomed 717 of the best tanks on the planet before most of them ever saw a German. Because the tanks were nowhere near the battle. They were scattered across Ukraine, some 300 miles back. Now they had to drive to the fight. Take Dmitry Ryabyshev's 8th Mechanized Corps. 932 tanks, but only 169 of them, the modern KV and T-34. The other 763 were the old, exhausted machines, rated to run barely 310 miles before they needed an overhaul. Almost 200 of them needed a full factory rebuild before they should have moved at all. Ryabyshev was ordered to march that corps roughly 310 miles in the summer heat on engines already dying. The march destroyed the corps before it reached the enemy. Half the old tanks simply died on the roads. A road wheel seized on one machine. A transmission let go on the next, and 2 miles on an engine boiled dry and quit, with no recovery vehicle and no fuel truck near enough to matter. The crews shoved what they could off the road and left the rest behind, sick with the waste and helpless with anger at it. Overhead, the Luftwaffe worked the columns in broad daylight, unopposed, scattering the march further with every pass. When Ryabyshev's men reached Brody on the morning of the 26th of June, half his armoured strength was already gone. German tanks had not yet fired a single round at it. They had marched their own tanks to death, and the crews knew it, and the shame of it rode with them the whole way. Then there was the silence. Almost none of these tanks carried a working radio. Orders crawled forward by motorcycle courier or by an officer standing up in a turret hatch, waving the machines behind him on. Command posts lost whole divisions for a day at a time. The plan, the timing, the direction each corps was meant to strike in arrived late and garbled, when it arrived at all. So the corps never attacked together. They came up one at a time, exhausted, fed into the German line and stopped there one at a time. The Germans had radios. They gathered at each threatened point in turn and dealt with each Soviet corps alone. 6 hammers, swung one after another, every one caught, instead of all 6 landing at once. And behind every corps, the fuel ran dry. In the 12th Tank Division near Dubno, 56 kV heavy tanks and 100 T-34s drove into the attack and then stopped dead. The armour was untouched. The engines were sound. They had simply run out of fuel and shells, with nothing coming up behind them, so they halted in the open and the attack was over. 156 of the best tanks on Earth taken out of the war in a single afternoon by an empty supply line. The tanks had done nothing wrong. The tail that fed them had never been built. And still, gutted and blind and half-starved, the armour almost pulled off a miracle. On the 26th of June, Ryabyshev's corps struck near Brody and caught the Germans on the move, out in the open. The heavy tanks did what they were born to do. They rolled the German screen backward. The 34th Tank Division cut the main road feeding the German spearhead. Then a strike group of some 9,000 men scraped together from the wreck of that division under Brigade Commissar Nikolai Popel, drove clean through and seized Dubno itself on the 27th. Popel's tanks were now sitting on the enemy's supply route, deep in his rear. For a few desperate hours, the whole German advance in the south had a knife against its spine. Popel knew exactly what he was holding, and his men had paid for every yard of it. Colonel Volkov's tank regiment had smashed the first line to get there. The first enemy barrier, a battalion of infantry and a company of tanks, were shot down, Popel wrote. The Germans were not ready for defence. His men pushed through wet ground and took the enemy gun pits at point-blank range. "We are walking through the swamp," he wrote. Grenades explode, shots ring out, we burst into the firing positions of the Nazis. All 3 batteries, with serviceable guns with stocks of oily gleaming shells, are ours. They even turned the enemy's own tanks around. 30 captured German machines were formed into a battalion under a Captain Mikhalchuk. A man named Ivan Kiryovich Gurov led a raid with them and gave the signal to attack at midnight. Popel had a fortress and a stranglehold on the German supply line. What he did not have was a single friendly soldier behind him. This is where command turned on its own men. With Dubno taken, the Soviet High Command lost its nerve and its coherence in the same hour. Kirponos, feeling the Germans pressing his flanks, ordered a general retreat, which would have left Popel to his fate. Zhukov countermanded it and demanded the attack go on. The two of them fought it out for nearly 2 hours while the tanks idled and burned fuel they could never get back. In the end, nothing reached Popel. Help never came to hold the ground he had bled for. He was left 100 miles inside the enemy, fuel gauges falling, shell counts falling, betrayed by the silence from his own side. Some commanders refused to feed the fire any longer. Konstantin Rokossovsky, leading the 9th Mechanized Corps, looked at what he was ordered to charge into and stopped. In his own words, "The enemy outnumbered us to such a degree that I took on the personal responsibility of ordering a halt." A corps commander was defying the counterattack from inside it. He could see it was pouring good tanks into a furnace for nothing. Inside Dubno, Popel's pocket held on the order he gave his men, an order he set down later, almost like a prayer. Stand to the death. You are showered with bombs, and you stand. They hit you with guns, with machine guns, and you stand. You can fight with anything, a rifle butt, a stone, a boot, a Finnish knife. But you have no right to retreat. They held on those terms until there was no choice but to break out. The men who died there died covering the rest. Colonel Vasilyev, commanding the 34th Tank Division, was lost in the fighting. Efim Ivanovich Novikov held his howitzers in place to cover the retreat and was lost doing it. A Major Sitnik ran his KV straight at German tanks and rammed them, 45 tons of steel as the weapon of last resort when the shells were gone. When Popel finally broke his survivors out, they fought their way roughly 125 miles through the German rear before they reached their own lines late in July. The Soviet account credits him with bringing out around 1,700 men. A more recent American history puts the number closer to 900. Either way, the finest armoured strike group the Soviet Union could field in June 1941 came home on foot, carrying rifles. Every tank was gone. Every gun was gone. By the 29th of June, Ryabishev's 8th Mechanized Corps, which had started with 932 tanks, was down to a handful. Within a week, it had 43 left. About 1 in 20. The 4th Mechanized Corps, under Andrei Vlasov, had been the strongest of all 6. 979 tanks, 414 of them, the modern KV and T-34, the best armed corps in the whole Red Army. Its tank divisions were gutted in days. One of them counted just 65 tanks left back at its assembly point by the evening of the 27th. Across the whole battle, the Southwestern Front lost more than 2,600 tanks in 6 days. The German Panzer Group lost a fraction of that and kept rolling toward Kiev. The loss column hides how those tanks actually died. They were not, in the main, shot to pieces in a fair fight. The Luftwaffe claimed about 200 of them from the air. Some fell in real tank actions, where the Germans dragged the 88mm guns up in time. But the largest share died like the tank this story opened with. Clean armour. Empty fuel tanks. They sat on a Ukrainian roadside because the engine had failed on a march it should never have been sent on. No fuel came up, no shells, no order that made any sense, and no radio to beg for one. They were abandoned by crews who had no way to fight and nowhere to go. The German army did not defeat these tanks. It drove past them. The waste was not total. For all that the counterattack failed, it forced Kleist to stop and fight for ground he had expected to seize at speed. Some historians credit those 6 days of Soviet attacks with slowing the German drive on Kiev and dragging German divisions sideways to deal with Popel in their rear. It was not the grand encirclement Moscow had demanded. Yet the men had bought something real with it. They spent their tanks and their lives to buy time, because the plan left them no other way to spend themselves. There is a grim courage in that, and it deserves to be named. That is the hard truth of Brody. The Soviet Union brought the best tanks in the world to this fight, in numbers the Germans could not match, against a gun the enemy admitted could not stop them. And it lost anyway. It lost because that magnificent machine was handed to a system too broken to carry it. The fuel sat far behind it. The radios were missing inside it. The orders arrived late and in pieces, and they demanded the one thing that guaranteed disaster. Attack now. In fragments. Into the strongest point of the enemy. Against the judgment of the men on the ground who knew better and said so out loud. The crew that walked away from the running KV-1 in that wheat field had done nothing wrong. Their tank had beaten every gun ever pointed at it. It failed for the one reason no armour can survive. Nobody above them had thought about what it would drink, or how it would hear an order, or whether the attack it was thrown into made any sense at all. The best tank in the world, sitting in a field, full magazine, dry fuel tank, waiting for a truck that was never sent. The German army did not earn that one. The men who owned the machine threw it away.